Thank you so much for being here for our first community conversation of the year. I'm Hari-kirtana, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you and an honor to have you here with me. I'm looking forward to another year of these community conversations. And I wanted to start this year with a conversation about positive freedom. And I'll give you a little bit of background as to how and why I wanted to begin the year with this topic. It's something that I actually think about fairly often. It's something that I've personally lived with my whole life and have had the privilege of being able to take for granted based on where I was born, the kind of body I received in this life, that sort of thing. And more recently, there are questions about the continued viability of freedom on at least geopolitical levels. And I suppose influenced primarily by that, I picked up a book called On Freedom by Timothy Snyder, which I highly recommend. And he talks about this idea of thinking of freedom in two different ways, as positive freedom and negative freedom. And while he is dealing with the issue on a social and political level, there is also the issue of freedom as it is understood in yoga. And naturally, I extrapolated what he was writing to apply to the principle of moksha, of liberation, of what we think about in our yoga practice as freedom. And what is the relationship between these two ways of being free? So I'll begin with just the meaning of the word freedom, according to the modern dictionary of the internet. I saw, when I asked Dr. Internet, what is the meaning of freedom? What I got back were three definitions. They are the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. 2, the state of not being subject to foreign domination or despotic government. 3, the condition of not being imprisoned or enslaved. And the first definition, the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants. I remember when I was a child, the way my mother explained to me the specialness of democracy in America was that anyone could get up on a soapbox in the town square and say, the President of the United States is an idiot, and they wouldn't go to jail for it. You wouldn't actually be prosecuted for this. And therefore, you know, we live in a special place because not everybody has that. And, you know, we can see quite clearly from right now, India, even though it is a democracy, there are journalists in jail for doing exactly that. In Cambodia, that sort of thing can get you killed. Around the world, freedom of speech is, which was always hard to come by, maybe even more difficult to come by, Here in the United States, the definition of freedom of speech is being changed from freedom to criticize the government to freedom to tell any outrageous lie you want without there being any consequences for it. And the other thing that struck me about these definitions is how they are negative. So the right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance. So no restraint. The state of not being subject to foreign domination, a negative. The condition of not being imprisoned or enslaved, a negative. It's the negation of restraints on freedom. And this idea of negative freedom fuels a lot of what is going on right now politically. Freedom from government regulation. Certainly the entrepreneurs, the tech bros don't want regulatory constraints. If you're in the fossil fuel industry, you don't want regulatory constraints. The idea of intrusion of government overstepping, of activist judiciary, stuff like that. It's a conception of freedom from the government, as opposed to what the government does to create positive freedom with structures and institutions that are designed to support and maintain it. And then in yoga also, there is this idea of negative freedom, freedom from the influence of illusion, freedom from avidya, the influence of ignorance. And oftentimes what we hear in yoga is that's it. That's the idea. That's what liberation is, freedom from illusion. And not freedom to act according to our true nature. We don't really get an awful lot of information in most of the paths of yoga about what do you do after you've stilled the mind and you see the true nature of the self. Then what? What do you do? What are you now free to do? So I wanted to explore freedom, the meaning of freedom, and how we think about freedom, both on the sociopolitical level, on the yogic level, and then see if there is some relationship between these two places where we experience freedom of one kind or another. So that's my introduction to the topic, and now I will ask you, what do you think of when you think of freedom in your life, in your community, in your country, in the world, in your yoga practice, in any of those categories? What does freedom mean? What do you think of when you hear the word freedom? And you can just unmute yourself if you like, or you can raise your hand if you would prefer to type something in the chat.
Now, I've thought a lot about this. We did a workshop about it actually in April. There are many different aspects that I find very interesting. I'll raise a couple. The first is, you kind of alluded to this in your introduction about the freedom to say whatever you want, even though it might not be true, right? And this is particularly relevant today with the announcement from Meta that they're removing the restrictions, that now basically there won't be any fact checking and things like that. And like, I'm a member of the queer community, and people are very afraid actually about the danger that will come to them, not only online, but also offline as a result of this. And so there's this point that, in terms of the interdependence of human beings, that one person's, freedom in that sense, that kind of the freedom that doesn't bear in mind karma and an interconnectedness. One individual's freedom creates the entrapment and the unfreedom, if you want, of
Hmm.
other beings. So that's dangerous, and it kind of like, for me, the phrase is the liberation of the individual liberation is not possible without the liberation of the whole, right? And so we think about this a lot in terms of like how freedom and responsibility are actually codependent, because the way that we are connected to each other means that if I'm going to oppress you, then ultimately I'm going to be trapped, because the people who try to create freedom by oppressing others ultimately get trapped by the fear of losing their own power, which is why we have now increasing violence in from the people who are occupying these positions of extreme power, who have apparently extreme freedom, but actually, at the heart level, I always try to think about like the inner space of people who are doing violent things, like politically and geopolitically. I always try to think about like what their hearts are like. I don't think they're very free in their hearts you know. Um, so yeah, that's what I'm going to offer.
Thank you very much. A lot there. Yeah, fear is definitely a state of unfreedom. And fear of someone else's freedom means my lack of freedom is one of the driving forces of the oppression of freedom for the other. And yeah, I think that that fear generates a lot of untruth that we've seen historically and we're seeing now. That untruth accompanies unfreedom, both on both sides of the coin. On the side of the person who is acting violently in the interest of oppressing the other whom they fear will take their freedom away. And in the book that I mentioned on freedom, two things came up for me as I was listening to you. One is the necessity of solidarity, that freedom for all is actually the only true freedom for anyone, and factuality, that if we don't have a shared sense of reality, that that also creates unfreedom. Thank you very much for sharing that. In the chat, Delia, it's like trapping a wasp against the wall with a takeout container. You're stuck there against the wall forever now. Yes, on the assumption that a paper plate is not within reach to slide under the container, then yes, you have to stay there. And so now you have become a prisoner of your own imprisoning, that you have to maintain that. Delia, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I want to speak about a more personal, individual aspect of freedom, which is freedom from compulsions, addictions, delusions, expectations. I'm fortunate enough to live in um, like a local environment in the country and everything where there is a lot of freedom, and my life in particular is pretty free of like me, like I don't have to do stuff that I don't want to do generally. But I have been trying to quit smoking for like forever now. I've quit smoking like 5 times. and then it'll stick for like a few months and then I go back to it. It's not something that like I fully enjoy. I would prefer to leave it behind. And I'm like, well, am I free to act without impediment or restriction? Well, no, I'm a slave to that particular habit. And then there are some other kind of non-ideal habits. That I think that there's a like a mental and an emotional component. I think about this a lot. Like, if someone has a very strong emotional reaction to something, are they acting freely or are they kind of like a slave, like subject to that overwhelming thought or emotion at that time? I don't really have an answer to that question. It's just something I think about a lot.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that's one point. I've also been working a lot to like undo some like early Christian Catholic religious like programming and stuff like that, which like it feels like a lot of the things that like I a lot of times I feel like I can't live out the full extent of my nature or personality because it feels spiritually unsafe to do so, more because of this like other religious baggage, which is
Mhm.
different from yogic philosophy. So I'm talking specifically
Yeah.
about Christian Catholic. And then the last point is, well, I guess related to that is that for me, it's become really important to be able to um, like explore my own questions and my own answers to things. So freedom to learn, freedom to doubt, freedom to question, freedom to make mistakes without risking like eternal destruction or
Mhm.
death or something like that. So, yeah, I hope that was somewhat clear.
It was totally clear and a nice contribution because you're bringing up another kind of freedom. We started out with social freedom and its impact on an individual. So there's an extrinsic freedom, then an intrinsic freedom, the internal freedom from, say, a psychophysical addiction or psychological, psychospiritual conditioning. And that inner freedom has more to do with yoga and spirituality because we can dig deeper down into the idea of being conditioned to respond to things in a certain way, to act in a certain way, not by choice, but because Mother Nature made us this way, or our environment. In your case, say the religion we were brought up with, made impressions on the mind that are now very difficult to iron out. In Sanskrit, they're called samskaras, impressions on the mind that make us respond a certain way. That even when we know what it is still difficult to free oneself from them. So thank you for bringing up this other aspect of freedom, this inner personal freedom that goes hand in glove with the external social freedom. Paula in the chat, is there truly such a thing as freedom? As members of a society, aren't there certain boundaries on our freedom? For instance, we are not free to drive 100 miles per hour on the roads. You haven't been to Washington, D.C.'s highways, I guess, or it's certainly the roads leading into Atlanta. My experience has been everyone thinks they're free to drive 100 miles an hour. So, Paula, this is a good point. When is a restraint on freedom a good thing? When is a boundary a healthy thing? And something that supports freedom. So for example, we should, let's say in the wonderful world of should, we should be free to drive down the highway without fear of someone driving dangerously fast, so fast that we don't even see them in our rear view mirror and they're already zigzagging through traffic and zooming past us, such that it would be dangerous for us to change lanes on account of the threat of someone driving way too fast. So in a sense, I think you are correct in that freedom too, positive freedom, actually requires boundaries. It requires structure that supports freedom. And those structures, by definition, have to be a restraint on behavior that impinges on the freedom of the whole. So solidarity, everybody has to agree that at least being within 10 miles an hour or so of the speed limit is how we all agree to drive in order for everyone to be free from fear on the highway. And we have this in yoga as well. The whole point of yoga is to see the true nature of the self, which means to become liberated from the influence of ignorance that brings about the fluctuations of the mind that obscure our vision of our true nature. So what is the first thing in yoga that supports attaining this freedom? Restraints, yamas, the restraint of nonviolence, the restraint of being truthful rather than just making stuff up. So yeah, this is actually a nice segue into the question of what enables freedom, or how is freedom from balanced with freedom to, or how does freedom from enable freedom to? What kind of structures do we need in order to really experience as much freedom as one can experience, both socially on the highway with other people, and also internally? How do we free ourselves from internal conditioning, either religious conditioning or the conditioning of the three qualities of material nature, the gunas, that make us a particular way? Any of you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so kind of pulling in from the beginning of the conversation with Emma, which touched me deeply. And then as you talked about solidarity, and one of the reasons that I wanted to be here present today was around coming off of the spinning for me of the election, and how I thought I had, I was shocked, I was taken aback. And from there, something huge has happened for me. I love the synchronicity in life. I was certified to teach yoga through Yoga Farm Ithaca. And Jeannie O'Neill is beginning next week a class in social studies. And our two books to read, one is called White Women, Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is A People's History, written by, his last name is Zinn, A People's History of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Howard, but last name is Zinn. I think there's like 8 million copies sold. And what's opening up, in first beginning, when I thought about freedom, I would think in the yogic tradition, freedom from suffering, freedom from the thoughts in the mind, working around that, all this internally. And now, as I sit here especially reading this book, to feel the opening of what I personally, as a white female, need to unlearn and relearn has been eye-opening, and specifically just from the standpoint of not realizing to what degree just being born white female uh, has had a trickle down effect. And so in all of these things that I'm like, oh, well, I supported this and I didn't vote for them and I voted for them. And then just to learn so much deeper and more. So I'm excited about that. And I'm really grateful that you're having this conversation today, because for me, it's like, okay, I've got some work to do here that I was very blind about, very blind about. And I think from there, for me, doing this work is what's going to strengthen and help build solidarity and strengthen our voices as we come together, because freedom is being very personalized, slung around, and obscured, in my opinion. So,
Evelyn, thank you so much. It's a really good question. How does my presumption of freedom, or the exercise of freedoms that I take for granted, or that I'm not even aware of, how does that impact other people? How does that create unfreedom for someone else? And then what can I do to constrain myself in such ways to create freedom for others? I'll continue with that thought for just a second, but Evelyn, if you'd be kind enough to pop the names of those books into the chat for everyone. For example, ahimsa, nonviolence, the first of the yogic ethical principles. If everyone is engaged in observing this restraint of nonviolence, then everyone can move through life without fear. You have no enemies, and no one has a reason to fear you. The same thing with truthfulness. If I observe the restraint of not saying that which is untrue on two levels. One, the basic being honest, but also acting or speaking in harmony with the highest truth I understand, then I'll be trustworthy, and everyone is free to trust. And that's a big deal, to be free to trust one another. Is a very, very, I think, very liberating thing. Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting thing about paradox, about like there's an idea of restraint, and like sometimes people are like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like, well, I don't want to restrain my freedom. I don't want to do yoga. Like, blah, like I just want to feel nice. Do you know what I mean? But actually, when we start to practice these so-called restraints, you can feel how much they give you. And Patanjali says that when he goes through all of the yama niyama, he says, if you do ahimsa, then there'll be peace all around you. If you do truth, all the things you say will come true. If you do asteya, non-stealing, you will get jewels. Awesome. He talks about your own personal benefit, and like you don't have to take it at his word, because when you start to do it, like I've got a really great and like banal example, which is that like Netflix, right? You go onto Netflix and you're like, I want to watch something, and you end up wasting 2 hours trying to choose something because you cannot choose anything, right? It's like there's a joke about the donkey who has 3 bales of hay and he starves to death because he can't choose between the three. that like too much freedom is actually, it's trapping. And so actually there's like, I'm preparing to do a thing about discipline and tapas for this weekend, that like within like healthy discipline, you actually find freedom. It's like within a structure, we just went, here I'm in the UK, we just all went back to work this Monday. And like after the expanse of long holiday periods, I was off work for 3 weeks. You're like, oh, in this, there's all this kind of different feels. Then you go back to work on Monday and you're like, okay, great, discipline. You know what I mean? You find there's like there's a balance within it. I think there's something to do with like balancing the forces that are at play on you. I think there's a lot to do with the gunas. I think there's a thing about like the push and pull of like how we integrate the many different forces that are moving through the world, and kind of like the restraint. It almost creates like a clear channel where you can flow without like the overthinking and without the kind of, I don't know, it's somehow something like that. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
All right, thank you. Um, yeah, these are good examples in yoga of how structure creates freedom, how boundaries, self-discipline actually creates freedom, and then this can be extrapolated out on a social level, that institutions that are meant to create freedom are absolutely necessary. And I think that's particularly relevant now, especially here in the United States right this moment, as we are looking forward to the dismantling of a great many of the structures and institutions that are designed to protect or amplify, support freedom. So this is, I think, true on both levels, that there is a necessity of freedom from in order to create freedom to. However, the freedom to is so often what is neglected, as evidenced by the definitions I found of freedom, that the emphasis tends to be on freedom from, and therefore that compromises our cognizance and aspiration to experience freedom too. And I'm going to get to that on a spiritual level in just a moment. But first, let's hear from Delia.
Emma's comment reminded me of something I read about how, like, if you're a creative person or an artistic person, imagine that you're in a workshop and you have like every single tool, medium, whatever, and then you have a big blank slate, blank canvas in front of you. It can be really overwhelming. But if someone gives you a piece of paper and 3 colored crayons and says, do something, it's a lot easier to channel your creativity into making something. And there's a quote, I don't know who said it, but someone said, give me the freedom of a tight brief. Just like knowing what parameters or what, where the boundaries are, so then I can work within them. So more about that, like the interplay of freedom with structure and order and boundaries.
This is a really good example that I can really relate to. I have, as a younger man, I had aspirations to be an artist, to be a painter specifically. And that tendency is still there, to create artwork. And for a while, I was really, really focused on doing computer art. And I found everything I was doing was abstract and pattern oriented. I really liked the op artists of the 1960s. And what I found I had to do is I had to create rules for myself, using 3 colors and RGB and then breaking them up into patterns. But I couldn't just not have some structure to the patterns I was making. I had to, in order for it to be beautiful, there had to be structure, which meant I had to create rules that I had to abide by, and they were just self-imposed rules. And I had the opportunity to work at one of the schmancy Manhattan art galleries before I moved to Washington, D.C. And one of the artists they represented was one of the 60s op artists, Bridget Riley, who I was very anxious to meet. I had the opportunity to meet her because she had a whole bunch of new work, and I could tell that there were rules. But she was a real artist, and I wanted to find out from her, like, how she came up with her rules, because I was just making stuff up. I was just arbitrarily deciding, oh, this will be the rule, and then I followed it. And so I asked her at the gallery opening, I had a chance to ask her, when you create these works, there's angles, there's distances, you know, how do you come up with the rules that you make to create the artwork that you're creating? And she said, I just make it up. I just arbitrarily decide what the rules will be, and then I follow them. This was very validating. But it was also a good case in point that even an artist, an abstract artist, in order to create beauty, has to come up with or follow some rules. And nature gives us rules. Mathematics and nature have a relationship that we find in Fibonacci spirals and golden ratios and, you know, all this sort of thing. So a principle, one of the symptoms of freedom, I think, is beauty. And beauty requires this balance of unpredictability, an attribute of freedom, and boundaries, rules that support that freedom. So Delia, thank you for providing that nice example. I want to share something with you from the bhakti-yoga tradition about freedom. When I thought about this particular conversation, one of the things that occurred to me is the question of the issue of why removing obstacles to freedom, obstacles to moksha, liberation in yoga, is only half the battle. And to do this, I'm going to share a set of verses from the Bhagavad Gita. These are verses 20 through 23 in chapter 6, and I am referencing the translation of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada for this translation because the wording he used is particularly good for the point that I would like to make and then hear your thoughts on. So here's the translation. This is a description of samadhi. The 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is a summary study of Patanjali's system in his Yoga Sutras. That summary, Patanjali summary, comes later. So the process of yoga is already extant. And here's Krishna's description of the perfection of that system. In the stage of perfection called trance or samadhi, one's mind is completely restrained from material mental activities by practice of yoga. This perfection is characterized by one's ability to see the self by the pure mind and to relish and rejoice in the self. I'm going to stop the translation here for just a moment because self here has two meanings. One meaning is the true nature of the self that one sees reflected in the calm, clear pool of the still mind. But the object of meditation that Krishna is describing here is Ishvara, or the universal consciousness personally residing within the heart of the yogi. So one also sees this super soul, not just the soul, but the super soul within the heart of the soul. So That's why the self has two meanings here. You see both yourself and you also see universal consciousness locally within your own heart. The object of your meditation that brought you to the point of being able to see your true nature. So continuing with the translation. In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness, realized through transcendental senses. Established thus, one never departs from the truth, and upon gaining this, he thinks there is no greater gain. Being situated in such a position, one is never shaken, even in the midst of greatest difficulty. This is indeed actual freedom from all miseries arising from material contact. Material contact meaning the influence of the qualities of material nature, the three gunas. And then in his commentary on this verse, this is also relevant. After nirvana, or material cessation, there is the manifestation of spiritual activities. Remember in the verse, it says that there is the awakening of transcendental senses, or devotional service to the Lord, which corresponds to Ishvara Pranidhana, something that we can engage in while we are conditioned, and then something that continues in our spiritually liberated state. In the words of Srimad Bhagavatam, also known as the Bhagavad Purana, Svarupena Vyavasistiti. Liberation is the permanent situation of the form of the living entity after he gives up the changeable, gross, and subtle material bodies. This is the real life of the living entity. Maya, or illusion, is the condition of spiritual life contaminated by material infection. Liberation from this material infection does not mean destruction of the original eternal position of the living entity. So material infection here can be thought of as artificial ingredients in the consciousness that cloud up the works so that we are unaware of our eternal true spiritual nature. One of my teachers characterizes this as pneumopathology, a disease condition of consciousness that covers the numinous nature of the self. Finally, Patanjali also accepts this by his words, Kaivalyam Swarupa Pratishtava Chitti Shaktir Iti. This Chitti Shakti, or transcendental pleasure, is real life. This is confirmed in the Vedanta Sutra 1.1.12 as Anandamayo Bhyasat. This natural transcendental pleasure is the ultimate goal of yoga and is easily achieved by the execution of bhakti-yoga. So there is this idea that beyond liberation, beyond moksha, there is spiritual life that does not depend on our material embodiment. This idea that we have transcendental senses through which we can engage in transcendental activities and transcendental relationships in a transcendental environment that is suitable for these kinds of spiritual loving exchanges. I'm wondering what you think about this idea. How does that strike you, this idea that there is something beyond freedom from material conditioning, avidya, ignorance, freedom from ignorance, and that freedom from ignorance enables freedom to engage in spiritual relationships with one another and with the universal consciousness through which we're all connected. Any thoughts on this idea of bhakti-yoga's proposition of freedom beyond freedom, freedom to that comes about as a consequence of freedom from? I mean, just in general, how does the idea strike you?
I mean, I think we're kind of talking about it already. I think that always these things are, it's a range because, like, I'm not claiming to be fully liberated spiritually and transcendentally. However, even being within a space which that we're talking about today, there's a shift of perspective where we're able to let go of the attachments to the things that you might crave, that you might want to be free to eat ice cream all day or free to drive at 100 miles an hour on the motorway, right? Um, there is already a clarity of vision that perceives the fact that we can experience something more globally beneficial than the attachments to individual selfish pleasures, such as driving fast or eating ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always believe in like the end goals, like the transcendental things, because I am already experiencing the thing that's on the halfway down the path, which is the fact that uh, because I can perceive, like I think that part of like the achievement of the clarity of vision of yoga, that what it gives us is the ability to understand paradox, and the fact that we can understand the fact that freedom and discipline are mutually codependent, right? And so already abiding in the state where we can feel that and understand that, it makes it more conducive to already seeing something beyond. Like if I am going to give up my desire to drive at 100 miles an hour, I can perceive something which is more valuable, which is universal well-being and like the ability to not be crashed into by a car, right? Do you know what I mean? Do you see what I'm saying? And so I think that, I mean, I know it also in terms of like um, connection with other humans. You can either do it by being like, I just want to do whatever I want, and you have to just tolerate that. Or you can create a structure of mutual respect that then gives you the ability to actually connect on a higher level of great understanding. And then you can connect in deeper parts of your heart because you actually are, I mean, that's the kind of really relationship building type of thing. And so then in terms of relationship to the world and its spiritual nature, I think that when you have that attitude of putting in the restraints which allow you to keep at bay, the material attachments, then you can actually like see through in a kind of matrix type of way to how much magic pervades the world. And then it kind of becomes like a self-perpetuating thing where because you see how much delight there is in the world, uh, you know, within the restraints or like out beyond these attachments, then it becomes easier to go without the things that you crave. And so then you actually end up being free, in the world and yet not of the world.
Emma, thank you so much.
But
You
I
know,
wanted to ask, please, could you remind me, can you tell us again what verses you read from the
yes,
Gita?
that those verses were chapter 6,
6,
verses
okay.
20 through 23.
Thank you so much. I sometimes need to perceive things written down,
Hmm.
as well as hearing with things like that. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Sure. Um, while you were speaking, one of the things that came up for me was this two things. One is you were speaking very reasonably about things that reasonable people will accept. And the world is so full of unreasonable people. And therefore, to be protected from unreasonable people, to be free from the fear of unreasonable people acting unreasonably, we once again need restraints. that are enacted and upheld by reasonable people. There is also the idea of paradox that you brought up and how we navigate through them. And one of the paradoxes that I've also been thinking about, is related to this idea of positive freedom, is that in order to have freedom of religion, one must also have freedom from religion, that those two things have to go together. Otherwise, you can end up with the absence of freedom to choose, or the absence of freedom to freely express whatever form of faith one practices. And the reason that's been something I've been thinking about recently is the incursions here in the United States of Christian nationalism into the public sphere, public schools and such like that. And so it's an issue that I have been thinking about, and thinking about how I will respond to, insofar as what does the bhakti-yoga tradition specifically have to say about the importance of maintaining a non-sectarian social environment in order for everyone to practice yoga, practice connection to spirituality, to themselves, to whatever their conception of divinity is. Because bhakti yoga is by definition a non-sectarian science. So thank you for, and that is something we may bring up in another community conversation later down the road. Katie, go ahead.
Hi, Bo. Thank you. I'm at work, so I'm sorry I haven't caught everything.
That's
And,
okay.
and also, I'm feeling pretty unfocused because a friend of mine passed a few days ago.
I'm very sorry.
Thank you. So I'm so glad you brought up freedom in liberation when we leave our body of the time. So I guess I just wanted to share some thoughts I had about that in the last days. And I hope it ties in, because like I said, I'm sorry I haven't caught everything this hour, but I'm glad I could halfway come. So, and it was interesting me talking about artworks and artists, because we have an artwork here at work at the museum that we talk a lot about, this sort of freedom from the kind of prison of the body when it's nearing the end of life and is in a pretty uncomfortable state. Yeah, and then I was thinking about how wonderful this friend was, who wasn't a devotee, you know, and I met her about a decade ago, but really had a lot of qualities and actions of a devotee. And
By a devotee, you mean like a bhakti yogi?
yes, thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, feeling some regret for not trying to visit her more often after she moved from Maryland. And but then thinking about how clear and how much we can feel our true relationships, you know. And I was thinking, even though I wish I visited more, I know how we know how we felt about each other, you know. And I was also thinking about other people and fearing, like, oh my God, what if this person in my life also comes to a seemingly kind of quick, you know, a young life in their current body, and feeling a lot of like kind of freak out and fear about that. And I sort of I was kind of almost hearing Krishna say, like, well, what are you what would you be missing? What would you miss that you don't have right now, right here? And what that is love. It's that real true sorry, exchange, you know. And like how much that is that is Krishna in the form of people in our lives that we're so lucky to have around us, who can be so giving and so just, I don't know, like, amazing. And that was a really nice feeling, like thinking Krishna's like, you have what do we that's everywhere, that's here, that's with me. And then I also was thinking how fun she was, and how like how enjoyable it must, because it's like all of us are this little spark of Krishna, and it's so unique, the form that we take. Of course our soul goes on and to maybe another human body or whatever's next. But in the current, it's so unique, like the qualities and the balance of the material energies that came about to for her form this time was so special and so unique and so fun. And I was thinking how Krishna must have enjoyed, like, being, like, enjoyed that form existing, for her life. So that was really nice to think about too. And then on another side, from when we first started the call, when you're saying, what do you think freedom is? I was thinking how what it made me think of, what is important is like freedom to react and engage and speak and think and feel and speak truthfully, when that is often kind of like sneakily taken away, and it's like a freedom taken away. Like, I'm sitting here at work across a man-made pond from one of the home of one of the richest people in the world. And, it's so classist. It's so unfair. And it's so like, it's so interesting how there's no freedom. All the rhetoric is like open and honest two-way communication, but in reality, you'll get fired, like, it's not, it's like covertly, totally not free. So I was thinking that how important it is to be honest about it, and not kind of pretend that like classism doesn't exist or something. So I'm sorry I'm so jumbled, but I'm feeling very emotional.
No,
So I think
okay. Thank
that's
you.
what I was thinking to share. Thank you.
Yeah, to that last point, freedom to make as much money as you want means you take away people's freedom to live a reasonable, comfortable life, to get, if you have the freedom to take everything you want and you have the ability to go with it, then you take away other people's freedom to live a reasonable, comfortable life, to get what they need. And then, in the Bhagavad Gita, one way to speak about Krishna's advice to Arjuna is to say that he gives him freedom from grief. The Gita opens with, you are grieving for that which you need not grieve for. And it concludes with, do not grieve. And after Krishna gives his whole argument. However, off the pages of the Bhagavad Gita, we find that for everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, including grief. After the battle of Kurukshetra has been fought, Krishna helps Arjuna and his family grieve for all who are lost. So there is a time for both these things. And so once again, freedom from one thing is freedom to another. Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? We are now at our finishing point, and I want to honor everyone's time. So Any other last comments or any last thoughts on this idea of positive freedom, its relationship to negative freedom, and how these two kinds of freedoms work together to support us both socially, personally, and spiritually? Any final thoughts?
Come up with a definition for myself over the course of this conversation. Positive freedom, freedom to create, to be yourself, to connect with others, to feel joy, to evolve and learn and make mistakes, and to survive and persist.
Thank you very much for sharing your definition and what it means to you. All right. Thank you all very, very much for being here, sharing this time with me and with everyone else here. I'm always very, very enlivened and encouraged by your presence and participation in our conversations. And the recording of this conversation will be made available as soon as I can post it for you. I look forward to seeing you all again next time. So thank you once again, Kelly, duly noted, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. I'll hope to see you all soon.